the morning on May 18, 1837, 9 flatboats descending the Tennessee River near Ditto's Landing, just a few miles upriver from here, were forced to come ashore due to storms and strong gusts of wind. Upon landing, 15 Creek Indians jumped out of the vessels and escaped into the darkness. The following day, the boats once more were forced to land, first right here at Decatur, Alabama, and again the following day at Brown's Ferry. With the boats separated upon landing, and once more taking advantage of the confusion, the poor weather, and the darkness, 71 more Creeks deserted the party. Frantic, the military agent overseeing the detachment, Lieutenant Edward Dease, offered a $1 reward for any Creek escapee caught, but only 15 were ultimately recovered. 56 had escaped seemingly forever into the nearby hills. The 71 deserters were part of a detachment of 543 Creek Indians who had been captured by the militia and U.S. military personnel in the Cherokee country. Having fled starvation, white encroachment, and warfare in their homeland, these Creeks were hoping to live peaceably in the mountains and valleys of North Georgia, East Tennessee, and Western North Carolina. But in accordance with President Andrew Jackson and Secretary of War Lewis Cass's removal program, these Creeks were hunted down and captured before being marched to Ross's Landing, where they commenced their journey to Indian Territory. When we think of Indian removal, we tend to focus on the sufferings of the travelers along the journey, the bully tactics of federal and state politicians and government officials. What oftentimes gets overlooked, however, are the resistance strategies employed by the Indians to counter the government's removal program. Indeed, as these desertions along the banks of the Tennessee River in May 1837 show, the Creeks actively opposed the removal westward and engaged in strategies designed to thwart the federal program at every turn. Creek resistance began the moment the removal era began in the Creek Nation. On February 12, 1825, Coweta headman William McIntosh, and I'll let you can kind of follow. This is the refugee detachment of 543 Creeks caught in Georgia and Tennessee and as far as North Carolina, and you can see their path down there along the Tennessee River here. Coweta headman William McIntosh and 50 of his cronies, family members, and business partners signed the fraudulent Treaty of Indian Springs, which ceded all Creek land in Georgia and a large portion of Creek land in Alabama in exchange for equal parts land in present-day Oklahoma. The treaty was illegal under Creek law, and 2.5 months later, on April 30th, McIntosh was executed for his treason. Creek headmen then went about crafting an effective public relations campaign to abrogate the treaty. Despite the presence of 2 federal appointed agents charged with convincing the Creeks to accept the Indian Springs Agreement, the headmen were able to convince both of them that 49/50ths of the nation disapproved of the document and that the treaty itself was illegally negotiated and signed. On January 24, 1826, the Creeks agreed to the Treaty of Washington, which retained their Alabama land. Unfortunately, their Georgia land was not reclaimed. Still, this proved to be an improbable victory for the Creeks, and the Treaty of Washington is the only Indian treaty ever overturned after it had been confirmed. Oh, I'm loud. Can you guys hear me? All right. The only Indian treaty that had been overturned after it was confirmed by the U.S. Senate and ratified by the President of the United States. And real quick, I'll let you take a look at William McIntosh there. He's the guy who sold the Creek land for equal parts land in Oklahoma. I can yell too, so just raise your hand if you're having trouble hearing me. All right. After overturning the Indian Springs Treaty, the Creek headmen went about trying to thwart voluntary immigration. The Treaty of Indian Springs allowed Creeks who wished to move to Indian Territory the opportunity of doing so with compensation provided by their travels. Federal officials also promised that any would-be immigrant would be subsisted for 12 months in the West while they get their fields up and running. The federal government insisted that this provision be included in the 1826 Treaty of Washington. The idea was that as conditions deteriorated in the Eastern Creek Nation due to the loss of the Creeks' hunting land, they would have no choice but to resettle west of the Mississippi River. While a majority of the Creek people had no desire to move west and simply wanted to live and die on the land of their ancestors, there were a few thousand people who wanted to rebuild their lives in present-day Oklahoma. Indeed, in November 1827, the first voluntary emigrating party, comprised mostly of McIntosh family members and allies, left the Creek Nation to resettle in the West. Fearful that the mass migration of Creeks to Indian Territory would, quote, break the nation, headmen began a concerted effort to stop people from leaving. Quote, denunciations of death were issued not only against would-be immigrants, but those who even encouraged the Creeks to move west. The Creeks also passed laws, quote, prohibiting Indians from acting as interpreters or those persons employed in endeavoring to produce an immigration, end quote. The biggest targets were the immigrants themselves. Creek leaders visited an immigration camp near Fort Bainbridge on the Federal Road and, quote, used every argument in their power to get them to return and not go. This included providing what the immigrants called, quote, the most foul falsehoods about the country on the Arkansas. And by scaring the immigrants by telling them that the first party, quote, has not got to the country they started for, implying that they would suffer and die during the journey west. These types of warnings were not new. In the months after the Treaty of Indian Springs signing, and still years before the McIntosh Party left for Indian Territory, Creek headmen had attempted to frighten potential traitors by warning that those who immigrated, quote, would be certainly murdered in the West, because, quote, there was a powerful nation that would destroy them all. In 1828, headmen held a meeting at Tuckabashie and directed the heads of the most prominent clans to unite in opposition to immigration. Indeed, the leaders of the Tiger, Wind, and Potato clans were able to threaten, cajole dozens of their people into retracting their promise to move west. Simple persuasion only went so far, however. Another effective tool, at least initially, were acts of violence. After a report circulated that people were, quote, flocking to these immigration camps, headmen organized a secret council. Thereafter, many Creeks, fearing for their safety, refused to enroll, while many others deserted the camps altogether. Those who stayed were attacked, like a man at Tuckabashie who was, quote, badly beaten, after declaring his intention to move west. In 1829, a would-be immigrant was killed. Headmen and the men under their charge specifically targeted these enrollment camps because large numbers of people were congregating in one place. Indeed, 50 Uchis were physically driven from Fort Strother, a rendezvous point for the second McIntosh Party that left in 1828. Some estimated that upwards of 200 Creeks had abandoned this camp and returned home. Only a few remained, and those that were there were, quote, wavering. At Fort Bainbridge, a child was kidnapped from his immigrating mother, the victim of an apparent Klan attack. The camp at 10 Islands, which is just near Fort Strother, was in a, quote, mutinous and disorderly situation due to the threats made against the enrollees. Creeks in camp at Line Creek were threatened by a prominent headman who, quote, used insulting language and told the immigrants that, quote, for a trifle he would cut their throats for leaving the Creek Nation. On another occasion, this chief, along with an accomplice, drew a sword and threatened to kill one would-be immigrant while pointing a cocked rifle at another man and threatened to shoot him if he did not desist from leaving. This enrollee had already been issued his public rifle. They each got a rifle, a kettle, and some blankets for going. It's a bribe, essentially, is what they're doing. They're trying to bribe the Indians into enrolling for immigration. He already got his public rifle for agreeing to move west, but ultimately did not leave with the second party, and an agent observed that the two men were hereafter seen perfectly happy together. And I should also mention another strategic resistance strategy would be Creeks who would just lie. They would go up to enroll, get their free blanket, get their free kettle, get their free stuff, and they would hightail it off, and they would never show up with no intention of showing up. Confiscation and destruction of property was another tool in the headman's arsenal. In a number of cases, whole horses were stolen in camp by Creeks opposed to immigration. You get instances of a horse stolen one night, recovered the next day, stolen again, the same horse that next night, recovered the next day. It's just ongoing, days and days and days. Some were irrevocably lost, while others were found with their bells around their necks missing in an apparent attempt to prevent their recovery. The federal agents and government property were also targeted. In early 1828, approximately 30 Creeks, under orders from the headman of Tuckabashie, burned a newly built government storehouse in Sylacauga, Alabama. The house was designed to store the guns, blankets, butcher knives, and kettles that were distributed to the immigrants. Around the same time, Tuscania, the son of the late chief Big Warrior, physically assaulted his own brother-in-law, William Walker, who was employed as an immigration sub-agent and had directed the construction of the storehouse. Although some claim the assault was over personal and family matters, it was clear to Walker that he was targeted because of his involvement in collecting Creeks for the second voluntary immigration. Although the threats of the immigrants worked to some degree, still 3,500 people ultimately moved to the Western Creek Nation between 1827 and 1835. And I'll just real quickly, just briefly, I got some maps here. So this is the fourth voluntary immigration. Most of them follow the same, I guess let me walk here. They follow more or less the same pattern. So Creek Nation is in this eastern part of the Alabama, and they would set up camps, enrollment camps outside of the Creek Nation, because if they did it inside the Creek Nation, obviously the headmen would attack them. And so they were trying to go as far away as they possibly can. And in one case, in the 4th, which left in 1834, they have the rendezvous point in Centerville, which is way outside the Creek Nation. Others are in Harpersville, which is right outside of Birmingham, etc. And they all most of them march up here to the Tennessee River and then past Cortland and Somerville and all these other towns. And this allows the women and children and elderly men to take boats, flat boats or keel boats down the Tennessee River. And then the men, who oftentimes are going to march overland because they want to watch their horses, they want to watch the wagons that are taking their property, they'll all meet up in Memphis, all right? To the west of Memphis is a treacherous swamp, the Mississippi Swamp, where just roads are inundated for miles and miles and miles. So the women, children, and elderly men would take steamboats, again, down here to Montgomery's Point, up the Arkansas River to Little Rock. The men would then walk through the swamp with their horses and their wagons. Depending on the time of year, they're wading basically in waist-deep water, sometimes more. So almost every immigration does this. They go up to the Tennessee River and then they march across, kind of crossing the corner of Mississippi and through Tennessee. The 4th party is the most interesting of the voluntary parties. They leave Centerville and they make a beeline for Tuscaloosa. They go through Columbus, Mississippi. They hug the Tombigbee, and then they make a straight shot up through to Memphis. They leave in December, and so they leave, and so every single day of this journey, it rains, hails, or snows, and it's in the middle of December. They don't get there till March, and they packed up. This camp was organized in April, September. Of course, in Alabama, it's extremely hot during that time, so they're wearing their summer clothing. All their winter clothing is packed in wagons. And the government agents are basically trying to find more enrollees to go. So they're stalling. They were supposed to leave in August, September. Now it's November. Now it's December. They finally leave, and they're in bare feet and summer clothing. And then this Mississippi swamp here is interesting because all that water is now frozen over. And so you have stories of the men who are crossing with the wagons, crossing with their horses. They actually, if you can imagine, they tied ropes around the horses' hooves and had to drag them. You can imagine a horse, the 4 legs going in every which direction trying to cross the ice. They couldn't get them across. They tied rope around the horses' legs and they dragged them across the ice. The steamboat, the women take steamboats. The Arkansas River is actually frozen, completely frozen together. And they can't get, they're about 5 miles to the south of Little Rock. They can't get any further. They don't really want to disembark because, of course, they have elderly people. They don't want to do that. So they start ramming the ice on the Mississippi or on the Arkansas River to try to break it up. That doesn't work. They actually get off the boat, cut down trees along the riverbank, hoping that the impact will break up the ice. That kind of works. Then they get to saws, and they literally lean over the end of the steamboat and just cut big chunks of ice off and they finally make it those last 5 miles. They realize, we can't go any further. And so, regardless of the snow and the cold weather, everybody, infants, elderly, they're gonna march. You can see here, they're gonna march from Little Rock because they can't get any further because of the frozen river, and they march. Of course, their destination is Fort Gibson. While few of the immigrants were friends and followers of the late William McIntosh, a vast majority had no relationship to the former Coweta headmen. So of the 3,500, probably, 800 were actual allies, friends, family members, business partners of William McIntosh, but the rest, 2,500, 2,700 or more, were people who realized, we're either going to starve to death in Alabama or we're going to try to make our go in Oklahoma, present-day Oklahoma. Instead, these Creeks left as a result of the deteriorating conditions found in the Eastern Creek Nation. And those that didn't go were stuck dealing with the deteriorating conditions in the Eastern Creek Nation. The loss of the Creeks' Georgia land in 1826 forced several thousand Creeks into the limits of Alabama. Due to the scarcity of good arable and unoccupied soil, many of these refugees began a long period of transience and starvation. Basil Hall, a British traveler who visited Alabama in April 1828, observed firsthand the precarious condition of the Lower Creek refugees only a year after they were forced from their homeland in Georgia. When Hall, his wife and daughter and family nurse crossed the Chattahoochee and stopped by the New Creek Agency, the family observed, quote, crowds who had been dislodged from their ancient territory to the eastward of the river and had not yet resettled and put roots in the new lands allotted to them. Hall observed that dispossessed lower creeks, quote, wandering about like bees whose hive has been destroyed. Having spent what little money they had, Hall reported that many were, quote, bordering on starvation, and, quote, great numbers of them actually perished from want. Hall's wife, Margaret, observed that the creeks were, quote, in a state of starvation and were flocking about the agency in eager expectation of supplies of food. Another traveler who visited the agency at about the same time observed, quote, the indiscriminate jabberings of crying hunger, as famished creeks devoured a barrel of flour provided by Creek agent John Kroll. The Creeks returned the next day and petitioned for more, while on the third morning, 500 Uchis arrived looking for corn. White encroachment was also a problem, as the loss of their Georgia land eliminated the woodland buffer between the Creek Nation and the traders, whiskey sellers, and speculators who inhabited the eastern and central parts of Georgia. After 1826, however, Columbus was platted on the eastern bank of the Chattahoochee River. No longer required to travel long distances over dangerous roads, these merchants could simply cross a bridge or use a ferry and within minutes be commingling with thousands of Lower Creek Indians. White traders subsequently arrived in the nation with spirits, especially whiskey, to trade to the Creeks for portions of their annuity or on credit at enormous rates. Indeed, one Swedish traveler observed a number of intoxicated men bartering, quote, several fine deer for whiskey near Fort Mitchell in 1832. Observing the white merchant take advantage of these intoxicated Creeks, the observer wrote, quote, never assuredly had whiskey brought a higher price or deer been so depreciated in value. By 1833, it was estimated that there were approximately 400 grog shops in the Creek Nation. White squatters also evicted Creek families from their homes and fields and stole their property. Haveman observed that brazen white settlers cleared land belonging to the Creeks, then threatened that if the Creeks so much as touched their property, they would prosecute them to the fullest extent of Alabama law. When the state government authorized the construction of the town of Irwinton on the land containing the town of Eufaula, whites wasted little time in driving the townspeople off and burning their homes to the ground. By one estimate, there are almost 25,000 whites illegally living in the Creek Nation, almost 3,000 more than the entire Creek population. The misery was only exacerbated by disease. Smallpox struck some of the upper towns about 40 to 80 miles from the agency in 1831. Unaware of the full scope of the problem, the Surgeon General only sent 12 vaccine treatments. Untold numbers of Creeks died of the disease. Many were found lying outside of their homes. To sanitize the area, the agents and went around and destroyed it by fire, the houses and the bodies by fire. As the Creeks sank further into despair, they made repeated trips to Washington seeking redress. Their two biggest complaints were the intrusions on their land by white squatters and the assertion of state jurisdiction over the Creek Nation. And this is we're not going to talk about the assertion of state jurisdiction, but it happened to the Cherokees, it happened to the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, and it's an illegal action by these states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, basically saying, you're not a sovereign nation, you're now under state control. And we can come in and prosecute you. If you do something wrong, we can arrest you and put you in jail. And this, more than anything, terrorized the Creeks. They were so terrified of being arrested and put in a Montgomery jail that they oftentimes just allowed speculators and whiskey sellers to take advantage of them because they were threatening the Creeks with arrest. And so they would just kind of allow the traders to take advantage of them because of that. During each of these trips to Washington, the Creeks were told that their salvation rested on the west side of the Mississippi River. Each time, the Creeks refused the offer. Officials grew tired of the impasse and the repeated visits by different delegations of headmen. Creek leaders often received a lukewarm reception when they arrived or were ignored outright. In 1832, officials proposed a solution. The Creeks cede the last of their domain to the United States, and in exchange, each head of family would receive a privately owned allotment. On March 24, 1832, Creek headmen reluctantly agreed to this and signed the Treaty of Washington. The benefits for the United States were clear. Allotments would open up vast tracts of Creek hunting ground for white settlement, and with the option to sell reserves individually, white purchasers could simply bypass the Creek Council altogether. So before, you'd have to approach the Creek Council. The Creek Council had passed a law against ceding Creek land without the entire agreement of the Creek Council. Of course, William McIntosh signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, which was not approved by the Creek Council, and what happened to him? He was executed as a result of this. So the Creek National Council was the last barrier for whites being able to purchase land. And so now you have this Treaty of 1832, which carves the Creek Nation up into individual allotments. And in fact, this was a perfect way that the United States could get a hold of Creek land, because they didn't have to go to the National Council anymore. They could go to an individual Creek Indian and buy the land individually. Many Creeks were starving, so if somebody comes in and says, I'll give $1,000 for your land, that's life-saving money, all right? So many, many pieces of land were transferred to white ownership, which I'll talk about here in a second. But the benefits, why the Creek signed this land, I'm still not 100% sure why. There's been a lot of debate. But it's difficult to fault the Haveman for agreeing to such a deal. Whites historically had little respect for the Creeks as sovereign claims to their land, and trespassing had been pandemic for a century prior to 1832. The Haveman likely believed that they needed to adopt white conceptions of land ownership, a title or deed, in order to force the Americans into taking their claims seriously. Because white land buyers no longer had to confront a united National Council, and because Creek sellers no longer had to worry about execution as punishment for selling Creek land, thousands of allotments were quickly transferred to white ownership. Some sold for life-saving cash. Indeed, one white man purchased 5 reserves from Creek, quote, suffering from the necessaries of life. Others sold because they were assigned an allotment on agriculturally worthless land, and still others decided to sell and move to Indian territory. Many, however, were cheated out of their half section by white fraudsters and land speculators. Not all frauds can be mentioned here, because as one agent noted, quote, the modes of practicing deceptions on the Indians were as varied as the ingenuity of man. The two most common types of fraud, however, were, quote, personation, whereby a speculator bribed another Indian to impersonate the true owner of the half section. The impersonator was usually versed in the details of the true owner's life and provided this information to confirm his or her identity. Starving Creeks were often targeted and bribed with food to act as impersonators because they were just desperate enough to turn on their townspeople. Once the land was signed over to the imposter, he turned over all but a few dollars to the speculator, so oftentimes a $1,000 piece of land would go for $10 to the speculator. But if the imposter was ever reluctant to hand over the money, however, agents reported that whites, quote, if they cannot get it in any other way, they take the Indian into another house and they choke him until he gives it up. Another common type of fraud was taking the purchase money back by force after the certifying agent had left. Some Creeks sold land for hundreds of dollars but retained only a fraction of that after the sale, while other Creeks had the purchase money stolen or in exchange for an unequal amount of goods like homespun. So what happened would be, you have a federal certifying agent. In order to sell the land, the Creek Indian and the white buyer has to agree. Yes, yes, they put the name down in a ledger book. As soon as the certifying agent walks away, then the white purchaser demands the $1,000 or $900 back or whatever. And so again, $1,000 pieces of land going for $50, $100, stuff like that. In some instances, the speculators were not above simple pickpocketing. Sire Yaholo, a mile chief of Tuckabatchee, and this is one of the most preeminent headmen in the nation, sold his land for $1,000, but soon thereafter, the white man who had participated in the transaction threw his arms around him, quote, in the attitude of hugging, and covertly took the purchase money out of the headman's pouch during his embrace. Rather than alleviating their problems, the 1832 Treaty of Washington compounded them. Landless, starving, and seemingly without hope, many Creeks sank to the depths of despair. Some turned to suicide. One agent observed that, quote, during the years 1834 and 35, the number of suicides committed by these people was enormously large. The warriors went into the woods and hanged themselves with grapevines. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, the Creeks continued to maintain their rich spiritual and ceremonial lives. Agents in the field who were attempting to collect immigrants for the next party reported that there had been, quote, several ball plays and green corn dances, and a number of headmen in the neighborhood of Fort Mitchell continued the maintenance of their council grounds by hewing the beams of their townhouses. But with the specter of immigration in the background, the 1835 green corn ceremonies no doubt took on a much different complexion than last year's busks. One immigration sub-agent who had attended the ceremony, probably the one at Tuckabatchee, reported that at the opening and closing of the festivities, the orator acknowledged that, quote, it was the last dance of the kind they would ever have on that ground. The speaker exhorted the people to remain sober and not to disgrace themselves so they could leave their homeland, quote, with honor. Indeed, soon after this, at Paula, he was the most prominent and powerful headman during the removal era. along with 7 other headmen of Tuckabachie and affiliated towns, announced that they would move to Indian Territory. The headmen sent word that they would consume black drink for the final time on their native soil, polish their sacred brass plates, and would be ready to start in a month. Apophyloholo also notified his people that he was, quote, preparing his traveling clothes and will put out all his old fire, and not rekindle it till he was west of the Mississippi River. In the midst of his collapsing world, however, Apophyloholo fully immersed himself in his spiritual cleansing at that 1835 bust. As agents tried to meet with the powerful headman about moving west, they were forced to wait until he had finished his black drink because, quote, during that operation they will not talk business or shake hands with any person for fear of spoiling the charm. Not all Creeks were resigned to letting whites steal and cheat them out of their land and move west, however. The Second Creek War began in earnest the first week of May 1836 near the Russell-Barber County line in Alabama. The war was a response to white encroachment, land cessions, fraud, and the constant demand for the Creeks to emigrate west. In the biggest act of resistance since the First Creek War almost 2 decades earlier, as many as 3,000 combatants created a path of destruction from the Chattahoochee River in the east to Tallahassee and Tuskegee in the west. Jackson and Cass responded to the hostilities by sending in the army and ordering those captured to be chained and transported to Indian Territory. The war had justified ethnic cleansing in the minds of administration officials, and emigration became forced removal. Those captured by the military during the hostilities were the first to be deported. On July 2nd, 1836, approximately 1,600 Creek prisoners, including women and children, began their slow 90-mile march from Fort Mitchell to Montgomery. This was followed by several hundred additional prisoners from Tuskegee. The Fort Mitchell detachment was broken into thirds and escorted by 2 companies of artillery. Nia Imafla, 84 years old at the time, a veteran of 2 Indian wars, the First Seminole War and the Second Creek War, was shackled in a group of 300 other common prisoners. Those who were unable to walk followed behind in wagons. The movement was clumsy and chaotic as the men were cuffed 2 together and a long chain passing between double file connected them all together, end quote. The procession was, quote, quiet except, quote, occasionally the utterance of an emphatic ta whenever 2 of them, pulling in opposite directions, would jerk one another by the wrists. The stoicism of the men contrasted sharply to that of the women who were, quote, shedding tears and making the most bitter wailings and distressing cries. Locals contributed to the confusion by accosting the party along the journey in an attempt to take the slaves, guns, and horses that were in the Indians' possession. Despite capture, many Creek prisoners attempted to make one last stand. A number deserted the party at Fort Mitchell and along the route. Others committed suicide. One prisoner drew a knife and slit his throat as he was being wheeled down a Montgomery, Alabama street in a wagon. Another was found hanging by the neck the night before he was to leave Fort Mitchell for the west, quote, preferring the glorious uncertainty of another world to the inglorious misery of being forced to a country of which he knew nothing but dreaded everything bad. A few attempted to make their escape. A father and son who were due to appear in a Georgia court on capital offenses were killed as they were being turned over to the authorities. As his captors fumbled with the handcuffs, the son grabbed a hatchet and struck one of the men in the head. He ran about 100 yards before he was shot dead. The father then picked up the weapon and attempted to strike the man a second time, but was bayoneted by a guard. Jacob Rhett Mott, an Army surgeon embedded with a company of soldiers fighting the Creeks and Seminoles, recorded in his journal that, quote, one of this very party of emigrating Indians, on his arrival at Montgomery, attempted his escape, but when caught and secured in a wagon, by some accident got possession of a very dull knife. With this, he made several ineffectual efforts to cut his throat, but not proving sharp enough, he with both hands forced it into his chest over the breastbone, and by successive violent thrusts, succeeded in dividing the main artery when he bled to death. Some of the Creeks' black slaves were also used the confusion surrounding removal to make their escape. 6 of Niamico, and he's another very prominent headman at this time, 6 of Niamico's slaves deserted him as he was being transported to Montgomery to await steamboat transportation. The first detachment of approximately 2,300 Creeks left Montgomery on the night of July 14, 1836. Approximately 1,500 Creeks rode the steamboat Meridian, while the balance traveled on the steamboat Lewis Cass. Both vessels towed barges freighted with Indians. A platoon of 40 men from the Alabama Artillery No. 1 was placed on each boat with orders to, quote, shoot any who might evince a hostile spirit or attempt to escape. Despite the show of force, some Creeks made one last attempt to desert the party. John Milton, future Florida governor, commander of the Alabama Artillery, who accompanied the prisoners on board the Meridian, discovered at 3 o'clock in the morning, quote, arrangements in progress among upwards of 30 of the Indians to escape. Although he did not know if the Creeks planned to use force, Milton ordered the guards to train their weapons on the Creeks in preparation for a worst-case scenario. But just as quickly and unexpectedly as the plot was discovered, it was extinguished. Milton reported that the would-be escapees had no idea their plans had made known, quote, until they discovered the entire guard on the hurricane deck in readiness to fire upon them. They then became quiet. The following day, Neamathla, no doubt tired from his decades of struggle against white subjugation, urged his people to become, quote, reconciled to their situation. The talk had its desired effect, and the commander was relieved to find the Creeks docile for the remainder of their time on the water. The Creeks, over time, were even granted some small freedoms. Whenever the boats landed to procure wood, the prisoners were allowed to go on shore and relax. During these respites, the captives swam, fished, bathed, or danced along the shoreline. When the bell rang, signaling time to embark, the Creeks, quote, came about without delay. The only other act of resistance during this journey was when a group of Uchis rolled the barrels containing the handcuffs into the White River as they were encamped in Rock Row in Arkansas. They had these hogshead barrels, and they had meat and food in them, and then sure enough, there's the handcuffs right there with no lid on it, and the Uchis in the middle of the night just rolled them into the river, and they were never recovered. This party arrived at Fort Gibson in Indian Territory on September 3rd, 1836. Despite the fact that a minority of Creeks had participated in the Second Creek War, Andrew Jackson and Lewis Cass demanded the relocation of the remainder of the Creek population. These Creeks, however, were not forced west at the end of the bayonet. With, quote, no legal right under the treaty to remove the Creeks, Major General Thomas S. Jessup conceded. Jessup was the guy who was sent in by the president to put down the Second Creek War, and then he'll go down and be commander of the Second Seminole War, conceded that, quote, their movements were necessarily voluntary. Hopelessly outnumbered by the Indians, however, military personnel were forced to work with the headmen in order to achieve their objectives. As a result, the main body of Creeks who left after the prisoners were moved through a combination of coercion and negotiation rather than brute force. Although the Creeks were not necessarily free to remain in Alabama, Lewis Cass made it clear that those not at war, quote, must be removed by military force if necessary. Creek leaders realized that they held an unusual amount of power considering the circumstances, and they demanded concessions in exchange for compliance. And so when it comes to Creek removal, the vast majority of the Creeks, growing up in high school, I just had this image. We were taught that, the Army comes in and they're just, at the end of a bayonet forcing the Indians off. And when you think of the Creek removal, it was kind of the opposite. Think of military agents literally begging the headmen, please get your people to move. And in fact, they gave up a total of $2,000 and a lot of other concessions. And he goes, if your people will march on this day, $2,000 is yours plus all these other demands you wanted. I mean, the Creeks held a lot of power during this. 5 detachments left Alabama in August and September 1836. Each was led by a private contractor who had agreed to the sum of $28.50 to remove each person. U.S. military personnel accompanied each detachment to ensure the Creeks' comfort and safety. And a surgeon attended to each party along the route. But again, the Creeks engaged in resistance strategies at every turn. The first stand occurred just 2 days into the march when the headman of Detachment 2 discovered that the route would not follow the same path as Apoculaholos. Encamped 18 miles west of Wetumpka, where the road forked to Tuscaloosa, the chiefs, quote, positively refused to proceed until a change was made. Although the contractors used, quote, every argument to dissuade the Creeks from taking the Tuscaloosa road, warning that there would be provision shortages, the Creeks would not give in. Noting that they were, quote, directed to follow in the footsteps of Apocalaholo, the headman declared that, quote, rather than disobey this command, we are willing to starve the 5 days. The military agent finally acquiesced, and the contractors were left scurrying to find food along the adjusted route. Meanwhile, Detachment 1 had decided against passing through Cotton Gin Port, Mississippi because of bad roads and scarce provisions, and chose to go through Moulton before changing their mind again, and both detachments passed through Russellville, Alabama 3 days apart without incident. The cost to the company was enormous, and the contractors spent years after the relocations trying to recoup the losses. Agents, however, knew they had little choice and conceded that if they had forced the Creeks to take the road to Eaton, he had, quote, the firm conviction that it would have been disobeyed, and thus with little influence I might have possessed over these people, frustrated at the commencement of a long and tedious journey. In reality, the contractors and military agents had very little influence over the Creek people. While encamped in Morgan County, Alabama, the Casita headman Tuckabatchee Harjo and other principal chiefs met with Detachment 5 contractors and demanded a day of rest. The party had just completed a difficult 17-mile march due to the scarcity of water, and to make his point, Tuckabatchee Harjo refused to accept the rations issued to him, quote, and advised his people not to take them either. Although Sprague, who was Lieutenant Sprague, who was in charge of Detachment 5, tried to convince the Creeks to keep walking until they found a more suitable location with more provisions, the Casita headman, quote, evinced much anger and left the tent saying, quote, word is out. The next day, Tuckabatchee Harjo begrudgingly consented to go on, and the party moved 14 miles over bad roads and through deep swamps. The following morning, Tuckabatchee Harjo again reiterated his demands, and the Casitas, quote, commenced throwing out their baggage from the wagons. In spite of all my efforts to prevent it, Sprague wrote in his journal, the headman and about 200 of his followers remained behind as the party broke camp and continued toward Memphis without them. They rejoined the detachment 2 days later. With only limited power over his charges, the agent and contractors pleaded with the Creeks that, quote, Tuckabatchee Harjo was not the person for them to listen to about stopping. All detachments reached Memphis where the parties were split, with most taking steamboats around the treacherous Mississippi swamp that lay just west of the Mississippi River. Still, many Creeks chose to walk through the swamps. This was about more than simple opposition to water travel. It was about the freedom from the presence of whites. Only a handful of employees accompanied the Creeks by land through the swamp, and those that did abandoned the party near the St. Francis River out of neglect. Left to themselves, many of the Creeks deliberately stalled their movements. Although most of the 400 Creeks discovered by Lieutenant Deese, who was in charge of Detachment 3, encamped along the road were there due to sickness or because of negligence of the contractors in failing to secure transportation of provisions, others like Narticker Tustanugi, Tuckabatchee Harjo's brother, and 100 of his people from Detachment 5 remained in the swamp into the third week of November and were determined to take their own time in coming. Even as the agents and contractors waited on the other side of the swamp, the land party refused, in spite of any remonstrance, and evinced the most hostile feelings and cautioned the white men to keep away from them. The Creeks hunted and sent word that, quote, when they got bear skins enough to cover them, they will come on. So here you get an image of the military agent on the other side of the swamp, waiting for the Creeks to come, and the Creeks are in no hurry. They're out hunting, they're stalling their movements, they're there for weeks and weeks and weeks. And meanwhile, this is costing thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to the federal government per day, every day they're out on the march. Sprague was fully aware of the symbolic nature these swamps had for the Creeks. Because of the swamp's isolation from people, it was here they felt independent and, quote, were almost out of reach of the white men. As the detachments crossed Arkansas, the Creeks became increasingly fatigued, while others grew more defiant, and the military agents were again reduced to pleading with their charges for compliance. Lieutenant Bateman, overseeing Detachment 1, complained that while all the Creeks were on horseback by 4 o'clock in the morning on November 2, it was, quote, impossible to get the Indians to stir. The following day, after riding 47 miles on horseback, trying to bring up the stragglers who were scattered 15 miles along the road, Bateman bemoaned that he was, quote, in despair of getting to Arkansas. Lieutenant Sprague, in charge of Detachment 5, continued to have problems convincing Tuckabatchee Harjo to obey orders. First, the chief declined to board a steamboat near Little Rock, and later to commence marching with his people west. Sprague pleaded with the powerful headman, but, quote, all his orders he positively declined doing. Quote, he wanted nothing from the white man and he should rest. Tuckabatchee Harjo and about 100 Creeks stayed behind while the remainder of the land party commenced moving west without them. When the steamboat returned sometime later, ironically with Tuckabatchee Harjo on board, he decided to to go. He had been picked up along the way. And rendezvous with the land party on October 14th near the Arkansas town of Dardanelle. The headman disembarked the vessel and refused to board, citing the large number of his family members who remained behind. Most of the Creeks subsequently refused to board along with him, and the agent only succeeded in convincing 300 to go. The following day, however, those same 300 Creeks who had joined the steamboat the day before, quote, commenced bringing off their baggage, and refused to continue because of a rumor, perhaps deliberately spread by Tuckabetchee Harjo himself, that, quote, they were to be taken into a distant country where they were to be placed under soldiers and their men placed in irons. After much pleading, 395 Creeks out of about 2,500, primarily the aged, feeble, and sick, reboarded the steamboat and continued toward Fort Gibson. Similarly, the agents of Detachment 3 spent the last leg of their journey pleading with defiant headmen Tuscuna, Harjo, and Menawa, as well as their followers, to quicken their pace. Noting the problem of leaving without the chiefs, Deef wrote that, quote, if we were to attempt to proceed with the main party before those in the rear arrived, the consequence would be that the whole route would be lined with stragglers. 2 of the most important chiefs are behind, and many of their people are now in camp, and if the party was to proceed, the latter would be, for the slightest cause, fall into the rear and wait upon the road for the arrival of their headmen, end quote. Unable to wait any longer because of dwindling provisions, Dee sent the main party on while he traveled back toward the White River to plead with the Fish Pond and Okfuskee chiefs to join the others. Although some of the delay was due to the negligence of the contractors, many of the Creeks were in no hurry to get to Indian Territory and subsequently stalled their movements. After ferrying the last of the Creeks over the White River, Deese complained that, quote, 2 days' delay was caused by the Indians refusing to travel in consequence of the severity of the weather. After walking 6 miles on December 19, 1836, the stragglers again refused to go on. Quote, I wish them to go 8 miles further, Deese wrote in his journal, in order to procure provisions and be able to overtake the main party tomorrow. They, however, persisted in refusing to go any further today, and I was therefore prevented from going on to overtake the main party, which I intended to do. So the Creeks are dictating, essentially, the traveling schedule, not the agents themselves. On December 21 and 22, with the weather very fine for traveling, Deese noted, the headmen and 400 of their followers again, quote, refused to proceed. According to Deese, Menawan was too intoxicated to travel, while Tuscuna Harjo, quote, evinced a stubborn, obstinate disposition, and everything that could be said to persuade him to travel was in vain, end quote. Unable to wait any longer, Deese broke camp and most of the party continued on. The Fish Pond chief, who had, quote, a considerable sum of money and good ponies, demanded to walk the rest of the way, quote, at his leisure. He was accompanied by approximately 100 of his followers. And I have no idea when Menawa or Tuscuna Harjo got back to Indian Territory. The rest of the party went on. They just left them there and said, you go when you want. Because Deese had basically given up trying to get them to move. While all 5 detachments arrived at Fort Gibson between December 1836 and January 1837, there were still many Creeks left in the east. Some were the warriors of those fighting the Seminoles in Florida, as well as their families. There were also hundreds of refugee Creeks in the Cherokee and Chickasaw countries. The Creeks only agreed to fight the Seminoles in Florida if their family members were allowed to remain in Alabama until their tour of duty was over. Encampments were subsequently established for these relatives at different points in East Alabama. But the presence of so many Creeks annoyed local militias, and they demanded that they be removed. To get their point across, they repeatedly harassed the Creeks and in some cases resorted to violence. At one of the camps, white militia members killed a 90-year-old man, his name was Lochichi Yoholo, who had been excused from mustering due to the infirmities of age. He's 90 years old. The old man was found, quote, lying in one corner, shot in the breast, and his head literally stove in with, as I suppose, the butts of muskets. The men also attempted to rape a 15-year-old girl, then shot her in the leg as she made her escape. The Creeks reported that the whites raped or attempted to rape a number of women in the camps, and in many instances stole their earrings and blankets. Out of fear for their lives, Creek women and even whole families fled into the swamps. Moreover, a company of troops had sent word earlier that they intended to apprehend all Creek men in the camp. Forced into a corner with few acceptable options, the agent reluctantly gave the Creeks the choice of, quote, either going to Tuskegee as prisoners of the whites with the militia companies or, quote, separating from their families or leave the nation with them. The agent noted that there was no hesitation. They preferred the latter, and in 36 hours afterwards, but 4 or 5 horse teams, my party of upwards of 1,900 strong, were on the march. They marched to Mount Meigs, Alabama, then to Montgomery, and took steamboats down to Mobile Point. As they left, whites pillaged Creek property, including horses, cattle, corn, furniture, and farming utensils. And as I mentioned, the Creeks were stationed basically at Fort Morgan down there on the Gulf. When yellow fever killed untold numbers of Creeks, they moved the camp to Pass Christian, Mississippi, which was considered a bit healthier. But ultimately, almost 200 people died of yellow fever at Mobile Point. The news of the Creek family's relocation to the Gulf of Mexico eventually reached the Creek volunteers fighting in Florida. Thomas S. Jessup reported that while some of the warriors were satisfied with the decision to move their families, many Creeks were angry and saw it as, quote, a breach of faith on the part of the United States. This complicated the government's war with the Seminoles. In fact, Jessup noted that the Creeks fighting in Florida, quote, if not disposed to favor the Seminoles, are at least not very zealous in our cause. With the exception of a very small portion of them, they were zealous and true until they received information of the removal of their families from Alabama and the outrages committed upon them there. So get the image of these Creeks are helping the government fight the Seminoles. They're getting money to do this. They're getting a lot of money to do this. Once they hear that their promises hadn't been kept, the Creeks basically lay down their weapons. They're not fighting anymore. Some actually join the Seminoles and fight against the United States. The Florida volunteers rejoined their family on the Gulf by October 1837 and commenced their journey up the Mississippi River. And of course, many of you heard of the steamboat Monmouth. Near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the Monmouth collided with a boat descending the river in the darkness of night, and approximately 300 Creeks were killed in the accident. This is known as Detachment 6, and it reached Fort Gibson in December 1837. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, agents scoured the Chickasaw country looking for Creek refugees, but only 300 were ultimately captured. Reuben E. Clements, the agent overseeing the party, declared that these were, quote, the most hostile Indians I've ever known, and he had a great difficulty to get along with them. Indeed, these refugees threatened and defied Clements every chance they got. Just as difficult as enrolling the Creeks was getting them to commence their journey westward. The primary rendezvous point was 1 mile away from a camp of removing Chickasaws. When the agent gave orders for the Creeks to begin their march to Memphis, the refugees, quote, bid defiance and said they would not start until the Chickasaw started. In fact, one Creek Indian named Billy absconded from the detachment and, quote, run away to the Chickasaw party. It's noted in the journal, run away to the Chickasaw party. These Creeks ultimately commenced and arrived at Fort Gibson in the last day of December 1837. The major operations of Creek Indian removal ended in December of 1837. We mentioned this party, or the 543 Creeks that went from the Cherokee country. They arrived in June of 1837. There were still small parties of Creek Indians that went back west into the 1840s, the late 1840s. But the major operations ended in late 1837. But Creek resistance did not end once removal ended. Haveman continued to fight the federal government's attempts to interfere in Creek affairs. In the spring of 1853, when a number of Indians were arrested for trafficking spirits, a U.S. deputy marshal entered the Creek country and apprehended the suspects, only to see a mob of Indians impede the arrest and set the men free. This had occurred in an unnamed town where the inhabitants had been brought to Indian territory, quote, in irons, meaning they were prisoners who were forced west as co-conspirators in the Second Creek War. Although writs for the Creek's arrest were subsequently issued, some military personnel believed that if the suspects were taken into custody, other Indians in nearby settlements who had come west in chains, along with bands of removed Cherokees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws with, quote, nothing to lose, would join the Creeks in a war against the United States. The Creeks had already placed warriors between their towns and Fort Gibson and sent their women and children away in preparation for battle. The crowd was protesting the right of Americans to enter their settlements without explanation or warning and, quote, seize and carry off some of their people. But of course, serving as a backdrop to all this was protest against removal itself. Thank you so much.
Video production made possible by the National Trail of Tears Association. The Trail of Tears Association is a non-profit, membership-based organization established in 1993 with the purpose of passing the history of this significant event in Native American history onto future generations. If you're interested in finding out more about the Trail of Tears Association or would like to become a member, please visit our website at www.nationaltoda.com. There, you can learn more about the National Association, the state chapters, as well as how to become a member. To connect with the association for upcoming events and to be notified when future videos are released, be sure to like the Trail of Tears Association Facebook page and subscribe to our National Trail of Tears Association YouTube channel. Thanks again for watching this video and for your support.